This week, the Jewish people complete the fourth book of the Torah, the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, which concludes this 40-year period. It's actually a little bit short of 40 years, from the Jewish people leaving Mount Sinai with the Mishkan, with the tabernacle at its center, and traveling circuitously through the wilderness for 40 years, and now arriving on the cusp of entering the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, abutting the Jordan River, really from the north, almost in the area where Syria is today. Not exactly sure how far north they were. And they're camped there. And this is where the narrative of the Torah, for all intents and purposes, ends. Because then the final book of the Torah, which we're going to start reading next Shabbat, a week from this coming Shabbat, is the book of Devarim, and that's literally the words that Moshe speaks to the Jewish people, which is a long narrative encompassing the final 37 days of Moshe's life, until recorded at the very end of the Torah, when Moshe goes up to the mountain and passes away, leaving Joshua in charge of the Jewish people. So one might hope for some kind of a dramatic conclusion to this fourth book of the Torah. You won't find it. It ends in seemingly a very ordinary way, just with the comment that everything that transpired, the viewpoint, the events, and the mitzvot, the commandments contained within this fourth book of the Torah, were all given by God to Moshe and faithfully transmitted to us. And with that, we end Chazak, Chazak, V'nit Chazek. We should all be strong, and we're ready to go on to the fifth and final book of the Torah and immerse ourselves in the final speech, the final directive that Moshe gives to the Jewish people just before he passes away. So when we began this book of the Torah 8 or 9 weeks ago, the book of Numbers, I presented two arcs to understand it. The first arc, based on the comments of Rabbi Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, is that this is the actualization of the Torah. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that the Jewish people stood at Mount Sinai. God spoke what we call the 10 commandments, the 10 statements to the Jewish people in front of everyone. And over the course of these years, the Jewish people were charged with actualizing and putting into place, fulfill the commandments, live according to the ethics and morals and imperatives of the Torah, live up to the standards of the Torah, and something that we, the Jewish people, continue doing until this day, striving, yearning, and honestly attempting to measure up, to grow through the observance of the Torah, to come to embody the values of Judaism and the values of the Torah, so that it could be fulfilled and we, the Jewish people, could fulfill our purpose in the world, which is to be a light unto the nations, to be a beacon of what it means to live with integrity, with commitment, with godliness, human beings being God's ambassadors on earth. That's one way of looking at the narrative. And that way of looking at the narrative causes us to scratch our heads at the end, because after all, it is largely a book of shortcomings. It records over and over again, episode after episode, where the Jewish people despaired, where the Jewish people complained, where the Jewish people yearned, let's go back to Egypt. Weren't there enough graves there? Wasn't the food better there? Weren't we more secure there? Whatever the issues were that gripped the consciousness and awareness of the Jewish people, what we know the ultimate outcome is that a journey that was destined to take perhaps as short as 11 days from the leaving of Mount Sinai 1 year after receiving the Torah, it was meant to take 11 days, primarily because of the sin of the spies' evil report on the Jewish people and many other pitfalls, it's delayed for 40 years. And in fact, it is an entirely new generation of Jewish people that are camped and poised to enter the land of Israel, to conquer it under the leadership of Joshua, and to take over this mantle of striving to fulfill what God has as a vision for mankind to be actualized through the example of the Jewish people. That's one arc of narrative. There's a second arc of narrative we mentioned in the beginning, which is really embedded in a cryptic phrase in the beginning of the Parsha this week, which is that the Jewish people were journeying from and simultaneously journeying to. And this arc of narrative, it's a nuance of difference, but it's an important difference to understand, is that the Jewish people had experienced 210 years of servitude, of crushing enslavement in Egypt. And now the Jewish people were meant to create distance from that experience, to rejuvenate themselves, to refresh themselves, to shed the impacts of living within an immoral society like Egypt, put space behind them, and along this journey, again, actualize and fulfill and study the Torah, which was new to them, and embed it within their consciousness so that they could leave behind the after effects of Egyptian bondage, and now be the people of God, able and ready to enter into the land. It's a nuance of difference, but it colors the way we understand the narrative. Interestingly, we read two portions this week, Matot and Masei, and it's the second one that's always read during the 3 weeks, because we're now in the period of time of the 3 weeks. And what does that mean? It means that we're reading this at a period of time which literally commemorates leads up to Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, begins with the 17th of Tammuz, the actual day in which the Jewish people worship the golden calf. So these are two periods. It's a space of 3 weeks of calamity for the Jewish people, where we take an assessment, again, maybe in parallel with this, how we've fallen short. The problem with this, and that's why the name of this class is Journey and Destination. The problem with this is that we could become despairing and down on ourselves just by looking back on the book of Numbers, and it is simultaneously yearning for the rebuilding of the temple and recognizing the fact that we have no temple because God doesn't live within us. After all, when the commandment was given to the Jewish people to build a mishkan, to build a meeting place, a dwelling place for God in the midst of the Jewish people. So we were told, build this home for Hashem, for God, and God will dwell within you. And so the rabbis have said throughout the ages that when the temple is destroyed, it's almost an afterthought on the part of God, because God looks within the hearts of the Jewish people. He sees that he's no longer has a place to live and dwell in our midst, within us, and therefore the building becomes an empty shell. It becomes an illusion of God's presence, because the main place and sanctuary of God is within us. And when we have emptied out God from within us, the sanctuary in effect becomes empty, becomes an empty shell, and then it's destroyed. And that's what happened when the Babylonians destroyed the first temple at the time of Jeremiah. And that's what happened. It was rebuilt 70 years later. During the time of the Second Temple, we suffered under the oppression of the Greek Syrians. And then ultimately, it was the Romans who occupied the land of Israel and destroyed the Second Temple. And today, 2,000 years later, we are yet in the midst of the Galut Roma, the Galut triggered by the Romans, Western civilization, however you want to construe it, where what remains for us is to internalize Jewish values and Jewish ideas and to forge within ourselves a deep place for God to dwell within us. And once we accomplish that, then the actualization of the rebuilding of the third temple can take place. Now, this requires perspective. And that's what I want to look at, this idea of journey and destination, how we understand it. After all, just parenthetically, when you go back to the earliest history of the Jewish people in the time of Abraham, God is making promises and promises and promises to Abraham in the book of Genesis. And Abraham doesn't doubt God's promises. But Abraham basically asks the question of God, Bama Eda, how do I know throughout all these generations, throughout human history, that your promises and guarantees, God, will be sustainable within the Jewish people? That's his big question. And the response to that question, shockingly, is God says to Avram, you should know that your descendants will be enslaved for a long period of time, 210 years, for generations, in Egypt, in a land not theirs. And they will be on the brink of spiritual extinction. And from there, I will save them, and I will rescue them, and I will redeem them, and I will draw them close to me. And that's the narrative of the Torah. And they will rebuild. But that pattern of building and drawing close to God and then blowing the opportunity and needing to rebuild again, that becomes the rhythm of Jewish history and of Jewish experience, repeated over and over and over again. You know, in the lifetimes of great Jews themselves, someone like who comes to mind is the Abarbanel, who was the leader of Spanish Jewry, who was the finance minister of the king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabella. And he was expelled from the land, and the Jewish people went from that height to becoming the pariahs of Europe. He actually sought refuge in Portugal. He was recognized again as a tremendous asset to the country. Within an 11-year span, he was elevated again to being a royal minister there. And again, the Jews were expelled. The long reach of the church clamped down in Portugal as well. So in his own personal experience, he saw the Jewish community rise to the greatest of heights of security and political power and recognition and comfort, albeit outside the land of Israel. He saw expulsion, forced conversion take place. He found a place of refuge, only to have that history repeated again in a very condensed way. And it was only after that second expulsion that he sat down and he wrote his commentaries on the Torah, and he wrote his commentaries on the words of the prophets, all within a short period of time, pouring out his heart to try to encourage us, the rest of the Jewish people, to understand that the rhythms of Jewish life, the journey and the destinations that we are going to encounter are fraught, and they are difficult to navigate, and it's difficult for us to maintain perspective. So we're going to look at these two partiot today in light of this journeys and destinations concept, and we're going to try to gain strength so that when we read these two Torah portions this Shabbat, and then we enter the 9 days and we prepare ourselves for observing Tisha B'Av and mourning over the loss of the temple, we'll be able to do so without seeing our own strength zapped away, but we'll be able to maintain a strong attitude of hopefulness and expectation and a resolve that it's worth the struggle to remain and to perpetuate and to strengthen Jewish life. Let's take a look at chapter 32, sentence 1. And this is on page 911 in the Art Scroll Chumash, if you're following along. And this is in the first of the Parshiot of Matot. So again, the setting is that the Jewish people are on, they can literally oversee the land of Canaan. When Moshe is going to climb up to the mountain, he can see throughout the whole land. He has that vantage point. So what happens here? The Jewish people have fought wars. They've conquered nations. They had a war against Moab to avenge the moral enticement of the Jewish people. They've conquered lands which they weren't set out to conquer, but they end up having conquered all this land, which is to the east of the Jordan River. We don't think of it as Israel much today. Maybe you think of it a little bit if you go up to the Golan Heights nowadays. But in other words, they were in the midst of this lush farmland. And that's where we pick up the narrative. The children of Reuben and the children of Gad had abundant livestock, very great. Page 911, chapter 32, sentence 1. And they looked at the place they were in and they said, wow, this would be a great portion of the land for us to inherit. So you can see already where the mindset of the Jewish people was. We're about to enter the land of Israel. We've conquered these lands. And Reuben and Gad look around and say, you know, we'd like to make this our homestead. We'll put our flag down here. And they approach Moshe in a very dignified way, in contrast to the way the Jewish people have in the past when they complained. And in sentence 5, they say, if we have found favor in your eyes, let this land be given to your servants as a heritage. Do not bring us across the Jordan. So what they're saying is, we would love to make this land the homestead for Reuven and Gad, for our two tribes. It suits us. It suits our trade. It'll support our cattle. We'd be happy to stay here. Now, if you think about this in a certain perspective, this is such a repetition of falling short of completing the mission. So much reverberates like the sin of the spies. You know, we're on the verge, we're ready to enter the land. Okay, let's explore, let's figure it out. Oh, it doesn't look good for us over there. What they're doing here is a little shocking, and frankly, the rabbis say that as you look through the course of Jewish history, Reuven and Gad, these two tribes, and half of the tribe of Manasseh was assigned to join them, really to help strengthen them. They were the first to be exiled. In the first exile, they're these missing 10 tribes, they're the anchors of that. Why? Because they chose to place themselves at the periphery of the Jewish community. After all, if someone asks you, where do you want to live in Israel today? Many people would say, Jerusalem. That's the heart. Some people have other preferences, but from a spiritual sense, why not choose Jerusalem, the Kotel, the Temple Mount, the opportunity to live at the epicenter of spirituality? But clearly, Reuven and Gad were, again, captivated by different considerations. We're going to be far away. We're going to be on the peripheral. It's going to be a big schlep for us to go to the temple on Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. But this land suits us. We're happy to dig in here. So what happens next? Moshe turns to them and he accuses them of undermining the spirit of the Jewish people. And he says to them in sentence 6, shall your brothers go up to battle and you settle here? Why do you dissuade the heart of the children of Israel from crossing the land that Hashem has given them? This is what your fathers did, the previous generation, when I sent from them spies to look out the land. So Moshe takes this so seriously. And again, if we put it in this position of journey and destination, what you see is a troubling thought. The idea that just on the cusp, it's like snatching defeat out of the hands of victory. Just on the cusp of the Jewish people entering the land unified, fighting the battles they're going to have to fight. And you should know, by tradition and in the prophets, no Jewish soldiers died during those battles. Okay, we would question in a modern sense, what does it mean to capture the land away from another nation? The Torah deals with that a lot. And certainly it's not something that we do to proclaim our military might or how powerful we are. But this was the plan of God. This, according to Rashi in the beginning of the Torah, is why the Torah says God created the entire world. And as the owner of the world, God assigns lands to different peoples at different times. And God was truly assigning this land, this holy land, to the Jewish people. He had promised it to Avram, Isaac, and Jacob. And he wasn't doing so out of disdain, but because in a spiritual sense, the local people had forfeited the land and the Jewish people merited it. And it was both things taking place that was going to enable this transition. And we, of course, historically experienced the flip side of that. When we no longer merited staying in the land. So there, it wasn't that other people merited it more than us, but it was that Hashem said, you can't stay here. This is not a land that supports people who are not devoted to spirituality. And hence the land has been so empty and barren to such a big extent that although it's hard to even hear these words today in the modern context, but in 1900, the world said in a chorus, wow, look at the land of, and call it whatever you want, Israel, Palestine, whatever you want to say it is. It's a land with no people for a people with no land, because that's the historic reality that was at that time. So Moshe calls them out. So here we have a tremendous confrontation. And as Moshe has explained to us, we're looking, this is a high stakes confrontation, because this again could trigger the Jewish people forfeiting the right to enter the land and God knows what else. What solves it? So if you turn over to the next page, to sentence 16, you see something very important. Vayikshu elav, vayamru. The people of Reuven and Gad, instead of opposing Moshe, instead of disputing with him, they approached him and they said, of course you're right. We may want to live in the suburbs, so to speak, of the land of Israel, but we will fight. We will be the vanguard in conquering the land. And this is where the word chalutzim comes from. We will be the pioneers. We will be the frontline troops. We will sequester our wives and our animals and our children here, but we make an absolute commitment in understanding the idea that the destination is not here, as pleasant as it is for us to live in these suburban communities on the periphery across the Jordan River. We will be the vanguard force. And so Moshe concludes a formal agreement with them, and all is settled. What I want to emphasize here is one particular point: the use of language and the way and the manner in which people speak to one another. They made a request respectfully. Moshe didn't attack them, but Moshe points out to them in very stark terms, you don't even begin to understand the ramifications of your request. And they respond by drawing close to Moshe. Rabbi Foreman, in a dramatic presentation, makes a lot of this word by Yigashu, just the way Judah approaches Joseph in the end of the book of Genesis, in the parsha of Vayigash, where they come and they stand face to face, an element of communication. But what can we conclude from this? That language matters so much. And the ultimate contrast is that here, where the leadership, the tribes of Reuven and Gad approached Moshe in a conciliatory way and said, you're absolutely right. We don't want to demoralize the people. If anything, we'll make a commitment now which will supercharge the people with a perseverance to cross the river with confidence and to arrive at the real destination that we're heading for. It was the use of language. What did we find in the sin of the spies? And I just want to call this out. If you go back to chapter 13, sentence 28, page 803, when the spies came back, they didn't want to speak to Moshe. They circulated in the camp. They were purposely seeding a sense of hysteria, of disunity. And they used one word, one critical word that resounds through history, and certainly reshaped the 40 years in the wilderness for the Jewish people. Ephes, it's all for naught. The word Ephes means naught. And we won't go into it, but there was no such thing as naught in the ancient world. The idea of a zero, no one understood that. You had something. There was no placeholder for naught. But that's what the word Ephes means in modern Hebrew. Do you have any rice? Ephes, I have none. I have naught. The idea was that you can see that the goal was to dispirit the Jewish people. So what do we see from this? We see how this difficulty of seeing something through from point A to point B to get to the destination. We see how easy it is to be distracted, to be lured away, to become despairing, to give up hope. And the most amazing thing of Jewish history is that in a couple of weeks, on the 9th day of Av, we're going to sit down and mourn the loss of a temple that none of us could really even picture clearly in our minds. And it hasn't been experienced for so many generations already. We have no real memory of it, but yet we have a hope and a yearning and a sense that we're still striving to reach the bar, and we're never going to give up, because that's what it means to be the people of God. It's not a false sense of arrogance or entitlement, and rather it's a humble sense of growing. And growing doesn't happen in a straight line. Growing automatically means a couple of steps forward and a step or two or three or four backwards until you're ready to grow again. It requires perspective. It requires a goal in mind, and it requires the tenacity to always uphold that goal. And that's what these final portions of the Torah are meant to imbue with us. And if we look ahead now, if we go to the final parsha of Masei, which begins on page 918, chapter 33, we find something really unusual. Here, these are the journeys of the children of Israel who went forth from the land of Egypt according to their legions under the hand of Moshe and Aaron. Moshe wrote their goings forth according to their journeys and at their bidding of Hashem. And these were the journeys according to their going forth. They journeyed from Ramses in the first month, and they go through 42 stations or points that the Jewish people camped throughout these 40 years. What is going on here as we're finishing the book of Bamidbar? Do we need a travel log? The fact of the matter is that many of these places are not mentioned anyplace else in the Torah. We don't really know what happened there. So surprisingly here, this is an idea of perspective. And remembrance and perspective are really two concepts that when we think of them in Jewish terms, we have to put them together. Because after all, you and I could share an experience and we could remember them accurately, but each of us have a completely different perspective on them. My perspective could be, whoa, life is hopeless. And your perspective could be, wow, we need to work harder. And of course, that's encapsulated in the famous episode where after the destruction of the second temple, where Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues were overlooking the Temple Mount, and they saw a wolf running in the destroyed area where the grandeur of the temple had been. And they cried, and he laughed. Okay? That epitomizes this sense that memory and experience are all determined by and shaped by perspective. So let's look at the perspective here. Rashi alludes to an unusual medrash. It's mentioned here in the Art Scroll. I'm pretty sure it's from Medrash Tanchuma, but Rashi doesn't really go into the whole medrash. But the medrash says, what's this doing here toward the end of the book of Numbers? So the medrash says, I'll tell you a story. Once upon a time, there was a king. And the king had a child who was very ill. And it was despairing. They went to doctors, and where they were, everyone said, this is incurable. There's no hope for this child. But the king, the father, unwilling to accept that verdict, says, I'm going to journey forth from place to place until we find the healing for my son. Nothing is going to stop me. And so he sets forth, and he ends up traveling through 42 destinations. And then at a certain point, the child is healed and cured. And then they start to come back. And once, so to speak, once the journey was done and they're returning home triumphant because the goal was achieved. So then the king, each place they stop, he smiles to his son. And this is where it gets a little tricky. And he says, wow, remember we were here, you were still so sick, you were throwing up. We had to wait for 2 weeks until you could regain your enough durability to go on, and they come to the next. Oh, remember here you were laid up for a year. Remember here this setback happened. Remember here how ill you were. Remember here how we wasted our time looking for someone to heal you and there was nothing there. And so they worked their way all the way back, and they returned back to their original destination, which of course was back home where the king was the king. So Rashi says that this Medrash is telling you a mashal, a parable, which encapsulates God's attitude towards the 40 years in the wilderness. God remembers all the places that sins took place, where the Jewish people fell short, where we were not able to actualize and fulfill what the Torah expected of us, what we were capable of doing. We weren't able to leave behind the residual contamination, spiritual contamination of Egypt, and we weren't able to look forward enough towards the real redemption of being fulfilled, of entering the land that God had promised to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and conquering that land. And eventually it took 400 more years for the first temple to be built. So nothing happened so quickly, but it was an unfolding series of events. So the question is, though, what's the analogy between the king remembering the difficulties of the son, seeing that the child is cured, compared to recounting places where the Jewish people sinned and fell short? And here, the Rosh Hashiva of Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Henoch Leibowitz, rest in peace, he answers this question in a very magnificent way. He says, when there's real love and commitment between a father and a child, so setbacks, it's not just that they're taken in stride. It's not that it doesn't sap the love or the relationship or the connection, but more so it becomes a building block of closeness, and going through difficult times actually builds the relationship within the person and shows the depth of their love and their commitment and their valuing of one another. And here we get Rashi pointing us in the way of a truly magnificent insight, which the Rosh Hashiva Zichron Uvracha is unlocking for us here. When we remember our own shortcomings, when we think about the times that we failed, in God's perspective, this is all part of the experience of life that builds towards fulfillment of the ultimate destination of the Jewish people, finding a place for Hashem's presence within each one of us, so that we could then re-enter the land of Israel and rebuild the temple on a spiritual level, where whatever building we would build wouldn't be an empty shell, but would rather be a reflection of our own personal greatness. We need to capture this uplifting perspective that is presented to us at the end of the fourth book of the Torah. We have to come to see ourselves through God's eyes. God values each and every one of us. God has a tremendous commitment to our success. And our success is not predetermined. It's not batting 385 for the season and breaking someone else's record. It's a question of us fulfilling our own capacity to become attached to godliness, whatever that level is, to achieve a sense of, I'm proud to be, to whatever extent I am, God's ambassador on earth. And I hope that together with all the other ambassadors of God on earth, we can sufficiently find within ourselves the spirituality to lead to the fulfillment of the rebuilding of the temple and ultimately the redemption of all mankind, not just the redemption of the Jewish people, but where the whole earth will become, as prophesied by Isaiah, a place of peace and harmony and love and people getting along with one another. And I just want to conclude by emphasizing the importance of speech and the manner in which we talk about ourselves, the manner in which we think about our own memories and our own lives, and certainly the manner in which we speak about other people. And this becomes the theme that's constantly brought up about the 3 weeks, but I want to put it in this light. I heard a very wise person ask last week, how does a person achieve love of mankind, love of their fellow Jews, love of their own members in their family? How do you reinforce that? How do you develop that within you? And the wise person answered without missing a beat, speak nicely about them. Emphasize through your words their strengths, their positivity. Use words that build bridges. Vayigshu, approach them, deepen a relationship. What does it change? It changes the whole way our perspective on ourselves as people as well. It's an interesting thing, but in a certain sense, building bridges to other people, seeing the good within them, emphasizing that, helping to build them up, then we find ourselves thinking about ourselves in the way that God's teaching us to think about ourselves here. Yes, you fell short, but you strove and you made efforts. And look where you are today. You're still yearning. You're still persevering. You still have this goal is alive within you. And that's the definition of reaching a destination that's meaningful and important. That's the takeaway from the book of Bamidbar. So yes, we're going to enter a final book of the Torah, which has difficult and very uplifting, but it also has difficult chastisements. It has criticism from Moshe, all for the benefit of us finding ways to improve ourselves meaningfully. But it all has to be within the framework of love and commitment and not putting ourselves down so that we become less striving, and certainly not putting down other people around us, so that this enterprise, this process, this journey towards creating positive strength, spirituality, a place for God within us will continue on, and we really could reach the ultimate destination. That's what we're here to take away from. When we say chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek, be strong, and strengthen yourself, which is the way we finish each of the books of the Torah. This is the message. This is the strength we need to find. This is why these chapters are read at this time during the 3 weeks, so that we can grapple with an honest evaluation of where we need to improve and how we can improve without losing sight of the depth of God's commitment to us and our expectation, our undiminished expectation of reaching the destination that God has mapped out for the world and for us, the Jewish people. So hopefully we can conclude this week, these 2 portions, and we can truly say, chazak, chazak, we are strengthened. We have deeper resolve, and we will certainly persevere. Any questions? Okay. Everyone should have a good evening. And please God, we should emerge from these 3 weeks of introspection and thinking and mourning over the loss of the temple with renewed vigor and strength and commitment to one another and commitment to fulfilling all that God intends for the world to fulfill. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.